All right. So Esther was at Bushra's waiting for a moment that she could approach the house. But first she had to deal with 3 young men. They approached her and they wanted her motorcycle. So Esther said to him, did you 3 notice the Mercedes down the road? And one of them spoke up. His name turned out to be John, Jon. He said yes, but we wouldn't touch that because we saw 4 men get out of that car that looked like you wouldn't want to deal with them. And Esther said, well, I can get you that car if you have some patience and back me up here. And so John said, well, what do you have in mind? And Esther said, well, you stay out here. Don't go anywhere. Stay out of sight. And back me up out here if anything should happen out here. And John thought for a minute and he said, all right. So they all 3, John and his 2 friends, walked behind the hedge, disappeared. Esther put her helmet on the bike, went up to the porch, walked up, knocked on the door, and waited for an answer. Nobody was coming to the door, and so she pounded louder and said, Bushra, Bushra. And she was rather loud. This is your friend Esther. I'd like to see you. I heard you weren't feeling well. And so she said, maybe I should go get your boss and we'll come back. Well, at that point, the door slowly opened and Bushra was behind it, peeking through a crack. She had only opened the door a few inches. And then Esther said, well, how are you doing, Bushra? Bushra looked to be very peaked and rather traumatized. And she said, Esther, I appreciate your coming here, but I'll be okay. You should leave. And Esther said, well, why don't you let me come in and visit you for a little while? Bushra said, no, I might be contagious. Esther said, well, Mr. Polo has been concerned, and he is thinking about coming back with me to see how you are doing. At that moment, Bushra opened the door a little wider and said, oh no, Esther, don't bring anyone back. At that point, Esther grabbed Bushra's clothing, pulled her out of the doorway, slammed the door open. Esther had grabbed Bushra to the point where she pulled her out across the porch and into the front yard. She had shoved her clear out into the yard. John and his friends quickly grabbed her and picked her up, moved her out behind the hedge. Esther stepped inside of the house, locked the door, and witnessed a man with a knife that had just fallen backwards. She grabbed the knife away from him after punching him in the neck. She broke his neck. Then slowly, Esther listened. She walked down the hallway. It was lengthy. She heard some whimpering. As she walked about 10 feet, on the right was a room. It appeared to be a dining room. A man was standing over a woman that was tied to a chair, and he was taunting her. And when the lady saw Esther, he had sensed she witnessed somebody in the room. He looked up, saw Esther. There was a gun on a table behind him. He started to move for that, but Esther took the knife that was in her hand, threw it at him, which landed in his head, and he dropped silently and softly, actually, to the floor. Esther went into the room, removed the tape from the woman's mouth, and she asked, actually, how many more were in the house. The lady said there are 2 more. 4 altogether. And Esther grabbed the gun that was on the table behind the man, walked back out into the hallway, and at that moment 2 men came up from the basement, and they had totally ignored the fact that Esther was in the house. When they saw her, they both reached for guns that were on their body. Esther quickly shot them both in the head. They fell dead. Esther walked up nonchalantly, saw a bulge in one man's pocket, tapped it with her foot, and heard keys. So she reached in, found the keys, and noticed that it was a set that also fit the Mercedes down the road. So she kept the keys and went back to the lady secured on a chair, and slowly pulled the tape off of her and explained to her that her name was Ester Saint. She was a friend of Bushra, and that Bushra was safe outside. She asked her name, and I believe the lady said her name was Layla, her mother. And she looked around, and as Esther helped Bushra's mother was in awe. She said, how can this be? And Esther simply said to her, if Allah did not want it to be so, it would not be so. And so they walked out onto the front porch. Esther asked Bushra's mother, Layla, to sit down. Bushra come running up, and the 2 of them hugged. Layla expressed to Bushra that all the bad people were dead, that her friend had killed him. And Esther said to him, you're safe now. and she expressed to them that somebody would be here soon to help them, and they would ask many questions. So at that point, Esther had phoned a good friend of her father's. His name was John, John, and they had served in the military together. Now, John was a chief coordinator of a secret agency entitled DATA, D-A-T-A, Department of Advanced Terrorist Activities. And she expressed to him that there had been 4 Mideast terrorists holding this family captive, and that she had defused the situation, and she needed his help. Well, within minutes, John would show up. But in the meantime, Esther took the keys, went out and met the 3 teenagers, John and his 2 best friends. I think their names were, let's see, I made notes here. Mike and Wes. And they went out to the Mercedes, and Esther looked in the car, and in the trunk was a duffel bag full of money and some guns, and she pulled them out, said, "This is mine." And she looked around for other crucial evidence and didn't find any. So then she opened the car and found some papers in the interior, and she pulled them out along with a couple handguns, put everything in the duffel bag, and said, "All right, why don't you take this car down to the McDonald's down the street, wait for me, and I should be there within 10-15 minutes, and we'll discuss what you should do with this car." And John said, "Who are you?" And Esther said, "Oh, my name is Ester Saint, and you should leave now because a federal agency is going to appear in about 10 minutes or less, and you don't want them to be asking questions." So John grabbed the car fob, jumped into the Mercedes, and his 2 friends did the same, and they disappeared. So as Esther went back to the house with a large duffel bag full of money and weapons, she went up to the porch, dropped them on the porch, and waited a couple minutes. Bushra and her mother, Layla, they were still hugging each other and so thankful to have this crisis over. But then a couple minutes, John pulled up, and he jumped out of the car along with a half a dozen other agents. Another car pulled up. Several more agents pulled up, jumped out. Everybody was dressed in plain street clothing except for John. He had a suit on. He looked like a typical FBI agent, and he had dark glasses on. Esther went up to him and said, "John, why are you wearing these glasses, dark sunglasses? You don't like sunglasses." John begrudgingly pulled the sunglasses off and said, "Esther, if I had your memory, I would be so pleased. I had to arrest somebody yesterday, and unfortunately, they didn't want to be handcuffed. And so it was a rough arrest, and I ended up with a couple black eyes." Esther looked at him and held back the laughter because he looked like a dark raccoon almost. And she said, "You know, John, Dad said I could always count on you. Thank you for showing up." And so John said, "All right, what do we have here?" Esther said, "I noticed that 4 men inside, they're all dead. They're wanted on the terrorist one sheet. I recognized them. And they were holding this family captive. The daughter is a friend of mine. She works at Marco Polo's for women. And I had a feeling that she might be in trouble, and she was." And John said, "All right." And so then Esther said, "I need a little help. John, I've got a title here to the car they used. Can you give me can you sign this over so that I can give the car away?" And John said, "I suppose, who are you giving it to?" She said, "Well, a few teenagers in the area helped me out here, and I think they deserve it." So they went ahead. John had with him someone that was capable of doing the paperwork. One of the papers in the glove compartment was the title. And so they signed it over, and Esther thanked John, and she took off. She went down to McDonald's, met the 3 fellows, and said, "Hey, you can have this Mercedes. It's worth quite a bit of money, but it's going to be hard to share it. But if you want, take it to my friend Jan's cycle shop.